Hi, everyone.
Hi. We're dealing with John Wesley Brady's book, This Freedom Whence Again, called in England Before and After Wesley. And I have to ask the question up front, could this book be published today? Would it find a publisher? Because it found a publisher back then because the entire Western world, the free world, was up against two very, very dangerous enemies. Fascism, specifically Germany at 1939-40, and the Allies, the Axis powers. It was also up against communism, and we made strange allies. We actually had the help of the communist state of Soviet Russia at that time in a combined effort against Germany. But now the entire Western world is under threat, not just from various forms of fascism that are on the rise, but also from subversive Marxism, which is communism in a guise, and also from Islam. So on every side there are enemies to Judeo-Christianity, and one of the reasons therefore that this book needs to be heard, and if you can find a copy, because I don't think it's republished right now, if you can find a copy, order it while you can, because this message is so controversial right now that it would get you accused of racism. So, that having been said, let's read Brady's own preface as to why he felt this needed to be said, and what difference Christianity had made to England and then to America in the space of about 50 years in the 18th century.
Okay, he starts with, America was born, avowed President Coolidge, in a revival of religion. Back of the revival were John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Francis Asbury. This fact, however much ignored or obscured by secular historians, will stand the test of patient, accurate research. But if this is true of America, it is even more true of modern Britain. Indeed, the designation New England is at least as applicable to the transformed England created by the baptizing fire of the evangelical revival, as it is to the American states established in the primeval forests of the Pilgrim Fathers. Britain's faith, fortitude, and resolution after the fall of France, when even hope seemed to have been vanquished, has been the wonder and admiration of all freedom-loving peoples.
So you can see that he spoke these words right after the fall of France to Germany, to the Nazi onslaught, and the inspiration of that to the rest of the free world is what he's talking about here. He says, but whence came this confidence and courage, this resolute, dauntless spirit that has refused utterly to bow before the mechanized hordes of the new paganism, Nazi Germany, and that, amidst deep, pervading darkness, has shone forth as a guiding star? Some will answer that this spirit is the unbroken heritage of the Anglo-Saxon people ever since the winning of the Magna Carta in 1215. Some will trace it to the virile independence of Wycliffe and his Lollard preachers in the 14th century. Some again will contend that it is the joint product of the Renaissance in the 15th century and the Reformation in the 16th. Others will connect it with the passion for liberty that characterized the Puritan upheaval in the 17th century, while still others will argue that it sprang from the French revolutionary doctrine of the rights of man, as elaborated by Voltaire and Rousseau in the 18th century. Now, all these movements, directly or indirectly, left their impress upon the British and American heritage of freedom and self-government, and that is indubitable. So also it is indubitable that the peoples of Anglo-Saxon origin and tradition have, throughout the centuries, developed a unique instinct for liberty.
Nevertheless, for 8 decades following the Restoration, 1660, Britain's moral, spiritual, and social life plunged from bad to worse. This period indeed marks the nadir of Britain's social history. Though calling itself the Age of Reason, it really was the age of the skeptic, the slave trader, and the financial and political charlatan. As those 8 decades wore toward their close, the slough of despond yawned just ahead. Moral and spiritual collapse seemed complete. The Cambridge Modern History summed up this period as a time of expiring hopes. It appeared that Britain's doom was sealed. Then came the transfigured Wesley, who, for 53 years, despite all persecution and contempt, contested 3 kingdoms for God, and he won.
The resulting evangelical revival is the watershed of Anglo-Saxon history. This movement became the spiritual Magna Carta of the common people of England. It recaptured the spirit of Wycliffe and the Lollards. It bore the fairest flower and richest fruit of the Reformation principles. It revived and made Christocentric the tortured soul of Puritanism. It established liberty, equality, and fraternity, not on the sand of humanism, but on the rock of a soul-purging and soul-nurturing faith. This peerless revival caused and then prodigal Anglo-Saxon people. I'll read that again. This peerless revival caused the then prodigal Anglo-Saxon people to find its soul. Now, what does he mean by prodigal? Well, he means that they'd wandered off into drunkenness, among other things. It was the national spirit. The national spirit was spirits. During that period. And then he goes on. So when you talk about these subjects as racism, as they're often branded today, this sense of cultural progress, and I think that's the accusation that will be brought against a Brady today, that he's guilty of racism and asserting the superiority of a culture over another culture. Well, look what he's doing here. He's contrasting Britain in 1660 to Britain after 1740. The same people, the same Anglo-Saxon race. This is not racism, but it is cultural comparison.
It's history.
It's history. But when we can't talk about those factors anymore, we've lost it. We've lost our mind and we've lost our soul. Anyway, Brady goes on. It created an epic era of freedom and social reform. The remarkable century of the Pax Britannica, and that's a kind of a play on words of the famous Pax Romana that Augustus Caesar was responsible for when Christ was born, by the way. Mm-hmm. This remarkable century of the Pax Britannica, just meaning British peace, is one of the fruits, but only one of the fruits of the revival sowing. The glorious heritage of liberty and social reform bequeathed to the modern Anglo-Saxon and American peoples has been fed at many springs, but the mighty river which carried those blessings far and wide is none other than the evangelical revival of vital, practical Christianity, a revival which mediated the gospel's inspiration and ethic not only to the individual, but to the home, the factory, the marketplace, and the seats of learning and government. This indeed is the truth which former Chief Justice Charles E. Hughes emphasized when he warned, quote, "The question today is whether we have enough of the old spirit which gave us our institutions to save them from being overwhelmed." Wow. If he had to ask that back then, how much more does it need to be asked again? The question today is whether we have enough of the old spirit which gave us our institutions to save them from being overwhelmed.
This volume is an abridgment and a revision of my recent and fully documented book, England Before and After Wesley. That work already has been run through 5 large English editions and was chosen Religious Book of the Month in England. The volume has been slightly condensed and in parts rewritten in the light of the fast-moving drama of contemporary events. However, nothing has been omitted which is essential to an intelligent understanding of the greatest moral, spiritual, and social epic the modern world has known.
My historical interest in the wider impacts of the evangelical revival developed indirectly. The years of research behind my book, Lord Shaftesbury and Social Industrial Progress, forced upon me the conviction that never can the achievements of that inimitable reformer be understood or appraised apart from the mighty evangelical movement that inspired his humanity. My later study of child welfare, Dr. Barnardo, physician, pioneer, and prophet, confirmed and deepened this conviction. For Shaftesbury and Barnardo are but representative of a glorious succession of reformers who, inspired by a common faith, enriched beyond measure the entire social heritage of the English-speaking peoples. Hence my interest in the present subject.
The 5 years of further research in England, which went to the creation of this study, were made possible by the interest and generosity of fellow Canadians who raised a special research fund for this purpose. Among the supporters of that fund were the Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, university presidents, and heads of daily newspapers in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Hamilton. Among them, too, were not a few common folk of varying creeds and parties, and of widely different walks in life. Without the practical support of these good people, who in all my investigations left me as free as air, the historical researches behind this volume could never have been completed. As the root of this subject are in English soil, the study, of course, had to be pursued in England, for there alone are the primary documents available, and there alone can the historical and geographical backgrounds be truly explored. The writer, however, a Canadian born, had the privilege of 4 years of graduate study in the United States, and always has he striven to weigh evidence in its relation to the New World and the self-governing British dominions overseas.
Readers who may wish to examine more extensively the historical sources upon which the author has drawn will find them indicated in the bibliographies and footnotes of the 3 above-mentioned volumes. Already, the unabridged version of this book has drawn forth more than 500 press reviews, editorials, and articles. They have appeared on all continents, in all manner of organs, and in at least 10 different languages. The author, too, has been the recipient of hundreds of letters from statesmen, scholars, religious leaders, and workaday people in all parts of the world.
Wow.
In his education, by the way, for this task, John Wesley Brady got a doctorate at the University of London, PhD. He was at Queen's University in Canada, Columbia University in New York, and the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada, and also Union Seminary. So you don't get credentials higher than this for a task like this, which is unprecedented, I think, both before and after. So he has the credentials to do this work, but one doubts whether he would have had this kind of support. I mean, he's got the Prime Minister on side, and a whole bunch of cabinet ministers.
All the universities, well, they wouldn't go for it now.
So that's another reason this book couldn't feasibly be created with that kind of credibility anymore, because you'd have to be hiding. You'd have to be in hiding the whole time you were trying to publish it. So it's a scandal that we've fought 2 world wars, and now we're at the point where all of the gains that were talked about in this book, those gains which had come in less than 100 years to the British Empire and to English-speaking people, all of those gains are now at risk.
Yeah. And people aren't aware of where they came from.
So in our climate of multiculturalism in the entire English-speaking world today, and many other nations as well, 80 years it's taken to get us to this. I think Brady would be ashamed of us, And I dare say the cabinet and the prime minister of that day would be ashamed of what we've allowed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can get this book, this Freedom Whence, we're now going to go on to the substance of the book, where he talks about England before John Wesley came along.
Mm-hmm.